It was supposed to be just another interview. Light, fun, maybe a little quirky. Exactly what fans had come to expect from Johnny Depp. The radio studio buzzed with laughter just moments before. The host was witty, charming, and clearly a fan, tossing questions about upcoming roles, favorite music, even which snack he'd take to a deserted island. Johnny played along with his usual laid-back charm, his voice calm, his words clever. Then, without warning, the tone shifted. The host leaned in slightly and asked, "Can I ask you something a little personal? About your scars?" The room froze. You could almost hear the air being sucked out of the studio. Johnny didn't respond right away. For the first time in the entire interview, he didn't smile. His hands, once relaxed, tightened just a little. The microphone stood between him and the question like a silent witness. The host tried to keep it casual, maybe even lighthearted, but it was too late. The question had landed, and everyone felt it. What followed next wasn't a joke. It wasn't a scripted response. It was raw, quiet, honest, and when Johnny finally spoke, not a single person in that room was ready for what he said. Just 15 minutes earlier. The studio had been filled with laughter, the kind that makes producers in the control room exchange thumbs up and say, "This one's going great." Johnny Depp was in rare form, relaxed, humorous, and surprisingly open. He had come in to promote his latest film, a dramatic indie project that had critics buzzing. But true to his nature, Johnny deflected the serious stuff with jokes and self-deprecating wit. He leaned into the mic, answering questions with a mix of mischief and mystery, the way only he could. Fans listening in probably had no idea that any of it was scripted, because it wasn't. That's what made Johnny so magnetic. He didn't act like a celebrity in interviews. He acted like a curious wanderer who'd somehow stumbled into. Damon still wasn't sure why everyone wanted to talk to him. The host was new to big-name guests, but he was doing well. Young, enthusiastic, and clearly a fan, he asked about Johnny's favorite bands, weirdest fan encounters, and what he'd cook if left alone in a cabin for a week. Johnny answered every question with a grin, but then something shifted. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the need to stand out. Maybe it was genuine concern masked as boldness. The host paused for a second longer than usual, then said, "I've always wondered. The scars you have, are they from a role? Or something more personal?" It wasn't accusatory. It wasn't even said with malice, but it was a line. One that hadn't been discussed beforehand. And the moment those words left his mouth, the entire mood changed. The joke stopped, the charm faded, and Johnny's silence said more than words. Ever could. It happened just as Johnny was chuckling over a story about accidentally setting off a smoke alarm in a hotel room while trying to make toast. The host laughed along, the sound of it echoing through the small studio, light and full of energy. Everything felt easy, natural, safe. Then, as Johnny took a sip of water and adjusted his headphones, the host leaned in slightly and said, almost casually, "Johnny, can I ask about your scars?" The laughter stopped, not slowly, not gradually. It was like someone had flipped a switch. There was no music bed playing underneath, no crowd noise to fill the silence. Just that question hanging in the air, sharp and uncertain. A quiet tension spread across the room. One of the producers looked up from her notes. The sound engineer froze mid-adjustment. Even the co-host, who had been smiling seconds before, looked sideways, unsure if they were crossing into territory best left untouched. Johnny didn't answer right away. He blinked, once, then lowered his eyes for a brief moment, as if trying to decide whether to pretend he hadn't heard or to face it. Head on. His posture shifted subtly, just enough to be noticed. The relaxed lean turned into something straighter, controlled. His fingers, which had been loosely resting on the desk, curled in slightly as though bracing. And then, without looking up yet, he gave a small nod. You want to know about my scars? His voice was soft, too soft for the moment. But it wasn't angry dot, it was something else dot, something heavier. The host cleared his throat, already unsure if he should have asked, but by then it didn't matter, because Johnny was about to answer. And the truth wasn't what anyone was expecting. Silence that filled the studio after Johnny's self-question was almost unbearable. It stretched out longer than anyone expected. The kind of silence that presses down on you, making your own breathing sound too loud. For a moment, it felt like time itself had slowed. Johnny let out a quiet sigh, the kind that seemed to carry years of weight. He didn't rush to fill the space. Instead, he looked down, eyes focused on the desk, his fingers tracing invisible patterns. His face softened, a mixture of sadness and quiet strength in his expression. Everyone in the room waited. The tension was thick, almost tangible. Listeners at home, if they could hear, would have been holding their breath too. Most people expected Johnny to deflect, maybe crack a joke or change the subject. After all, scars are personal. They're a secret most don't want to share with the world. But Johnny did something different. He looked up slowly, eyes meeting the microphone as if he was speaking to each listener individually. His voice was low, gentle, barely above a whisper, but every word clear and steady. They're reminders. He began, pausing just long enough to let it sink in. Reminders of things I survived. The words hung in the air, fragile but powerful. It wasn't a boast. It wasn't a plea for sympathy. It was simply the truth. And in that moment, the entire studio felt the weight of it. The scars weren't just marks on skin, they were stories. Stories of pain, struggle, and survival. Stories Johnny was finally willing to share. Johnny's voice softened further, as if he was stepping into a space he'd long avoided. These scars, he said, they come from different chapters of my life. Some were accidents, mistakes made while doing movie stunts. You know, the kind of risks that come with this job. Falling off a horse, getting cut by glass, things you might expect from someone in my line of work. He gave a small, almost wry smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. But not all of them, he added quietly. Some scars. Those were from fights, not with anyone else, but with myself. The room grew even quieter, if that was possible. The host's eyes widened slightly, sensing that Johnny was about to reveal something deeper, something far less talked about. Johnny took a breath, studying himself. You see, the real scars aren't always the ones you can see. His voice carried a weight, a shift from the casual tone he'd used before. It was like the curtain had been pulled back, revealing the hidden parts of his story, the deepest. Wounds, he continued, are the ones that live inside. The battles we fight when no one is watching. He paused, letting the words settle. I've struggled with my own demons, with pain I couldn't always explain. Sometimes those fights left marks on my skin, but mostly they left marks on my heart. For a moment, Johnny's eyes flickered with something raw and real. Vulnerability. It was a side of him rarely seen in public, the man behind the mask of fame and mystery. And that, he said softly, is why those scars mean more than just cuts or bruises. They remind me of the battles I fought when I felt most alone. The moments I wanted to give up but didn't. The studio remained silent, hanging on every word. No one wanted to interrupt. No one dared to break the fragile honesty filling the room. This wasn't just an interview anymore. It was a glimpse into the soul of a man who had survived far more than anyone knew. Johnny's voice grew quieter, softer, like he was sharing a secret meant only for the quietest moments. If I'm honest, he began, some of these scars, they trace back to a time long before the cameras, the fame, and the lights. He swallowed, as if the memory itself weighed heavy on his heart. My childhood wasn't the kind of story people tell around a campfire. It was filled with shadows of fear, tension, and instability. He paused, eyes fixed on a distant point. At home, things were difficult. There was yelling, broken promises, and a kind of silence that screamed louder than words. Ever could. You never really knew when the next storm would come. His voice cracked slightly, the weight of those memories surfacing. I learned early on to hide, to build walls, to pretend I was okay when inside I was breaking. He sighed, a sound that seemed to carry years of pain and longing. Some wounds you don't see, Johnny said, his voice barely above a whisper. They live inside you. He explained that those invisible scars were harder to heal than any physical injury. The fear, the loneliness, they stayed with me. They shaped the way I saw the world. They made me believe I wasn't enough, that I was somehow broken. The room was still. Listeners could almost feel the weight of his childhood, heavy and suffocating. Johnny's tone grew more vulnerable as he shared how the emotional trauma led him down darker paths later in life. I turned to things, substances, habits that promised to numb the pain, to make the shadows disappear, even if only for a little while. But, he added quietly, those things didn't fix the scars. They only covered them up. And eventually, the pain would find its way back. He looked up, eyes meeting the microphone again. The scars on my skin, he said, are only a small part of the story. The real scars are the ones that shaped who I became. Johnny's honesty filled the studio with a kind of reverent silence. No one spoke. No one moved. For a moment, the world outside seemed to pause, caught in the fragile truth of a man who had carried his childhood shadows long into adulthood, was still fighting to step into the light. Johnny's voice grew heavier as he moved into a new chapter of his story, the one most people only saw from a distance. Fame, he said, it's a strange thing. It gives you everything you thought you wanted, money, attention, opportunities, but it can take pieces of you in return. He paused, letting the words sink in. I was lucky, sure. I had success. People recognized me on the street, but behind the curtain, it was different. The isolation hit him hardest. When you're famous, people don't see the real you. They see a character, a version of yourself that's easier to love or hate. But the real me, I felt alone. Even in a crowded room, I felt invisible. He confessed the pressure to be someone else, to meet expectations that didn't belong to him. I was supposed to be perfect, charming, untouchable. But inside, I was struggling to hold myself together. Johnny's tone turned more serious as he spoke of betrayal. People I trusted, friends, partners, they let me down. Sometimes on purpose, sometimes because they didn't know how to help. It was then he began to harm himself, not just emotionally, but physically. It wasn't about wanting to die, he explained carefully. It was more like not wanting to live like that anymore. The pain inside felt too much. Sometimes, the scars on my skin were the only way I knew how to show what I was feeling inside. He sighed deeply. I wasn't proud of it. I didn't want anyone to see that side of me, but it was real. Johnny's voice softened, the truth hanging between the words. Fame might have brought me everything on the outside, but inside, it left me broken in ways no one could fix with money or applause. The studio remained silent, the weight of his confession settling in. It was a side of Johnny Depp no one had ever heard on air before, a man vulnerable, human, and painfully real. For the first time that day, the listeners weren't just hearing an actor. They were hearing a man who had survived the darkness. Even when the spotlight was brightest out then, Johnny's voice softened even more, as if recalling a moment that changed everything. One day, he said, I received a letter. Not the usual fan mail filled with compliments or questions, but something different. He paused, taking a breath as if the memory still stirred deep emotions. It was from a young man, a stranger, who wrote to tell me something that I never expected to hear. He said, "You saved my life." Johnny's eyes seemed to shimmer as he recalled the moment. This wasn't a celebrity fan telling me they liked my work. This was someone who was struggling, someone who had scars of his own, both seen and unseen. The letter went on to describe how watching Johnny fight through his own battles, how he kept going despite pain and setbacks, gave this young man hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, he could survive too. He told me that when he felt like giving up, he'd think about me, how I kept moving forward, how I didn't hide my scars, even when it was hard. Johnny's voice cracked slightly. Reading those words, it hit me harder than anything before. He admitted that he broke down that day. I sat there overwhelmed, realizing that my story, my pain, had actually helped someone else. For the first time, Johnny understood that the scars he'd carried weren't just reminders of suffering, they were proof of survival. Proof that even broken pieces could help heal others. That letter changed everything for me, he said softly. It gave me purpose. It showed me that sharing my truth wasn't weakness, it was strength. Johnny smiled faintly, a mixture of gratitude and humility shining through. After that, I knew I had to keep going, not just for me, but for everyone who needed to hear that they weren't alone. The studio stayed silent, the power of his story sinking deep into every heart listening. This was no longer just an interview. It was a moment of connection, a reminder that even the darkest scars can light the way for others. Johnny's voice took on a hopeful tone as he shared what came after that life-changing letter. After I read those words, he said, I realized I couldn't keep running from my pain. I had to face it. He talked about starting therapy, something he had resisted for years. At first it was hard, really hard. Opening up to someone, digging into all the dark places I tried to forget. It wasn't easy, but slowly the process helped. He began to understand himself better, to see the scars not as marks of shame, but as signs of survival. Johnny smiled softly as he recalled rediscovering old passions. I started playing guitar again. Music had always been a friend, but I pushed it aside. Writing songs, pouring my feelings into melodies, it became a way to heal. He also talked about a practice he found powerful, writing letters to himself. Sometimes I wrote about forgiveness, forgiving the people who never apologized, forgiving myself for mistakes I'd made. This wasn't about forgetting or excusing the past, he explained. It was about freeing myself from carrying all that pain. Johnny said the hardest part was learning to look in the mirror without hatred. For a long time, I hated who I saw, but now I'm learning to see someone trying, someone brave. He acknowledged that some scars never completely fade, and maybe they never should. They're part of my story, he said, but they don't define me anymore. Johnny's voice was calm, steady. I'm still a work in progress, but I'm here, I'm standing. And that makes all the difference. In that quiet studio, listeners could feel the strength behind his words, not the strength of a perfect man, but the strength of someone who chose to keep going. For Johnny Depp, redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about embracing it, learning from it, and living beyond it. And that journey back to himself. It was just beginning back in the studio. The weight of Johnny's words hung thick in the air. Everyone sat frozen, caught somewhere between awe and heartbreak. The usual buzz of conversation was nowhere to be found. The radio host sat still, his mouth slightly open, eyes glossy with unshed tears. He struggled to find words, but said nothing. Realizing some moments don't need them, Johnny leaned back slightly, his gaze steady yet gentle. Then, with a quiet, almost resigned smile, he said, So yeah, those are my scars. His voice was soft, almost as if sharing a secret with old friends rather than millions of listeners. No one laughed. No one moved to change the subject. The silence wasn't awkward or uncomfortable. It was filled with respect for the courage it took to speak so honestly, for the pain behind those words, and for the man who had just laid his soul bare. For a long moment, the studio stayed quiet, honoring the truth that had just been shared. Sometimes the deepest stories are the ones told without words, and in that silence, everyone understood exactly what Johnny meant. When the episode finally aired, the impact was immediate and overwhelming. Listeners across the world tuned in, hanging on to every word Johnny had shared. Social media erupted with messages of support, surprise, and deep emotion. Fans flooded platforms with heartfelt posts, many opening up about their own struggles, some for the first time. They wrote how Johnny's honesty made them feel seen, understood, and less alone in their battles. Comments poured in. He's not just an actor, he's a survivor. His scars are mine too, and hearing him talk about them gave me hope. This was the most real, powerful interview I've ever heard. Many shared stories of how they too had hidden scars, emotional wounds, past traumas, and how Johnny's words gave them strength to keep going. The hashtag Johnny Depp Real Talk trended for days, with people thanking him for breaking the silence around pain and healing. Even those who hadn't been fans before found themselves moved by his courage. For a moment, the world saw Johnny Depp not as a movie star, but as a human being, a man who had walked through darkness and come out the other side, willing to share his truth. The interview wasn't just a conversation anymore. It was a beacon of hope for many, reminding everyone that healing begins when we stop hiding our scars. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who carry the deepest scars. We don't always see the battles someone is fighting behind their smile, their laughter, or the way they carry themselves. Each scar, visible or not, tells a story of survival, pain, and courage. It's important to remember that everyone you meet may be carrying hidden struggles. A kind word, a small act of understanding, or simply listening can make all the difference in someone's day or even their life. Healing isn't a straight path. It's messy, full of ups and downs, and it takes time. And that's okay. It's okay to not be okay. It's okay to ask for help. It's okay to share your story when you're ready. Johnny's story reminds us that scars don't define us. They show that we have endured, that we have strength, even when it feels like we don't. Single quotes. So be gentle with yourself and with others, because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply keep going, and that courage is something we can all learn from. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts or experiences. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to subscribe for more true and powerful stories like Johnny's. Stories that remind us of strength, hope, and healing. And please share this video with someone who might need to hear it today. Your support means the world to us and helps us continue telling stories that truly matter.